that looks at the Great Resignation in the United States. And what they found in terms of industry average attrition rates in the United States in the first 4 months of the Great Resignation was that different sectors have been affected slightly differently. And we see the biggest resignations in apparel, for example, but also management consulting, tech businesses, and so on. Now, the interesting thing is that during the Great Resignation, what they've noticed is that companies within the same industry experience quite surprisingly big variations in the number of employees that were leaving the company. So you see, for example, a company such as, just looking at airlines, for example, right? You have a company such as Southwest that had much lower attrition than a company such as JetBlue. Same with media and entertainment. You have Warner Bros. Having much less attrition than a company like Netflix. So this prompted the authors of this review to kind of dig deeper and look into what is it that makes people really resign. And I want to share with you really interesting findings from their research. So they use various tools, including they've analyzed the profiles of 1.4 million reviews on Glassdoor, right? So, Glassdoor, I'm not sure if you're aware, is a website where employees leave reviews about their employers, right? So they talk about their experience working for a particular employer. And so what the authors of this study did is they analyzed those 1.4 million reviews. They looked at different data with regards to companies, and they were able to identify the top predictions of attrition during the Great Resignation. And I want to present them to you in order of their importance relative to compensation. So let's start from the bottom up. Poor response to COVID-19 is 1.8 times more likely to influence someone's decision to leave the organization compared to just getting a higher salary to at another company. The next one up is failure to recognize employee performance. And this was shown to be 2.9 times more a predictor of employee attrition, again, relative to compensation. So I hope it's clear what I mean by relative to compensation. So this is about leaving a company in order to get a higher salary, right? High levels of innovation. This was a very interesting one, right? And so they found that high levels of innovation are 3.2 times greater predictors of employee attrition compared to higher compensation. And it's interesting here, you look at what does that mean? And when you actually dig deeper into the data, into what Sal and Zweig found, is that cultures, or better said, companies that have a high culture of innovation also have high rates of burnout. Because usually in these environments, they're usually fast-paced environments. You have the type of personality, you usually have A-type personalities, meaning people who are overly motivated, overly driven, they want to work long hours, and inevitably they end up burning out. The second from the top is job insecurity and reorganization. And it is surprising to me, as I work with organizations here in New Zealand and Australia, the number of organizations who have gone through organizational change whilst navigating COVID. This is really significant, and it's a great number of companies that have experienced that. And we know from research that reorganization and job insecurity are 3.5 times more likely to predict employee attrition. And now, are you ready? What do you think is the top factor? And I'm just curious if you can just pop it in the chat. What do you think this top predictor of attrition could be? I'm just going to look at the chat. I'm just curious what our guess is. Your manager, the care factor, poor culture, manager, no career progression. And you're right, all of this, boss. And it's actually true. So all of this are bundled up under the term culture, and more specifically toxic corporate culture, right? So we've seen that it's 10.4 times a higher predictor of employee attrition compared to compensation. So that's very significant, right? And so what do we mean by a toxic culture? And so I want to go through the elements of what a toxic culture actually is. One, you have instances where employees feel disrespected. Oh, I think there's someone on mute and there's a echo. Yeah, cool. Then you have toxic leadership, right? And so a lot of you mentioned here in the chat, the manager, right? And it's indeed, so toxic leadership could be anywhere from a leader who's not supportive to a leader who's downright trying to sabotage their subordinates' career progression. Number 3 is lack of inclusion, diversity, and equity. And number 4, as an aspect of toxic culture, we have lack of work-life balance, right? So you have employees that are experiencing most likely symptoms of burnout, and most likely an inability to get the rest they require in a period of 24 hours, right? We all need to recharge in a period of 24 hours. And oftentimes when you have toxic cultures, that makes it impossible for staff to do so. Now, I would like to talk about one aspect of this particular toxic culture, and namely respect and incivility, right? So we saw that at number 1, we had instances where people felt disrespected. So I want to talk about this concept, which is in the title of our session today. It's a very important concept, that of incivility. So let's see what it means. So incivility describes social encounters that convey disrespect with low intensity and ambiguous intent. So what this means is a couple of things, right? Ambiguous intent means that it is difficult to tell if someone actually intended to be disrespectful or not, right? So for example, you're at work and you say hello to someone and someone doesn't answer back. Now there's a chance that person didn't hear you, but also there's a chance that they are being disrespectful, right? That's an example of an ambiguous intent. And now these interactions can happen both face-to-face or in remote communications. And usually if it's a one-off, right, we tend to give the benefit of the doubt. Even if there's a series of circumstances, we still tend to give the benefit of the doubt. However, when there are several repeated circumstances where we feel disrespected, where there is a behavior that shows a pattern, most of us tend to know, right, when we've been disrespected, and tend to ascribe an intention to that particular instant. Now, what's important for us to take into account here is that incivility is not bullying. Bullying is an offensive behavior that is much more serious. And usually when it comes to bullying, you have very clear roles in the relationship. You have someone who is in a position of power, who is abusive, and then you have someone who is the recipient of that. In incivility, it's much lower in intensity. And when you notice, if you notice incivility being present in your team, it's a very important sign to take into account, because it can breed more offensive behaviors, like stronger offensive behaviors such as bullying or harassment. Now, I want to talk about something very important, which is the incivility spiral. So one of the things about incivility is that it breeds more incivility. So whereas with bullying, there's a kind of a difference in status between the two people involved, with incivility, there's more of an equal exchange. So what I mean by that, if you are the recipient of disrespectful behavior, research has shown that the person is more likely to respond back with incivility. So that incivility breeds more uncivil behaviors, and so on. So it goes. And the interesting thing about incivility that has been shown in research study was that those people who have been recipients of disrespectful behavior, they are very likely to become disrespectful towards others as well in the organization, right? So one of the things that we need to understand about incivility is that it's a work group phenomenon. So what do I mean by that? I mean that it's not an individual problem, but rather is a problem of the culture of the organization, right? And it's a culture that tolerates or even promotes certain kinds of behaviors, right? And therefore, it is important for us to keep in mind when looking at issues of incivilities in the workplace to understand there is never one person that is isolated. There are conditions that allow for this person to exhibit certain behaviors that are disrespectful to others. So I want to share with you a model of workplace incivility that shows how workplace incivility is actually correlated to burnout and to poor job performance, right? And we've seen in studies that those who experience disrespect are more likely to engage in maladaptive behaviors, so behaviors that are unhelpful, that lead to a decrease in their productivity and job performance, that lead to an increase in symptoms of burnout, particularly emotional exhaustion. So we know burnout, for example, has 3 dimensions, right? One is emotional exhaustion. So that's feelings of fatigue, feelings of tiredness. The second one is depersonalization or cynicism. So what I mean by that is someone becomes more cynical about their job, that it doesn't really matter. It is less interested about how his or her colleagues feel, how clients feel, right? So that's the second dimension of burnout. And the third dimension of burnout is a lack of personal achievement. So feeling that you're not doing your job well, and which over time actually turn out to be true, because the more burnout becomes more severe, the less productive you are and the less able you are to perform your duties well. So we know that feeling disrespected leads to a series of maladaptive behaviors. And in a minute, I will show you what they are specifically, which in turn aggravate symptoms of burnout. And these are all correlated with turnover intention, right? So the intention of leaving the organization. Now, I want to share with you a very interesting piece of research that comes from Poreth and Pearson. So Poreth and Pearson are 2 of the top researchers in the field of incivility. So they've done extensive studies on this topic in organizations, and they were able to actually quantify the price of incivility. And so here's what they found. Prepare to be shocked. I certainly was when I read this. So among workers who've been on the receiving end of incivility or disrespect, 48% intentionally decreased their work effort. 47% intentionally decreased the time spent at work. 38% intentionally decreased the quality of their work. 80% lost work time worrying about the incident, right? Ruminating about it, goes on in your head. 63% lost work time avoiding the offender. 66% said that their performance declined. 78% said that their commitment to the organization declined. 12% said that they left their job because of the uncivil treatment. 25% admitted to taking their frustration out on customers. So this is pretty stark statistics. right? Now, I want to move on to the second part of our organization and starting to have a conversation about how to spot if your people are thinking about leaving. But actually, before we move on to the second part, I just want to give you an opportunity to share any questions you might have about the concept of incivility, or to share examples. Have you seen incivility in your workplace? It could be a past workplace or current workplace. So I want to share some examples. I would like to invite you to share in the chat, just so that we are on the same page, so that we understand the many facets that incivility can take. And I can start off with some examples. It could be a manager teasing, and I put it between this inverted commas, teasing an employee, right? This manager thinks they are being funny, that sense of humor, but for the employee, it feels disrespectful to be called out a certain name in front of colleagues, or to be put down in a certain way, right? That's one example. Can you think of other examples you might have witnessed? So you can put them in the chat, and then we can actually have a conversation to see if we understand this concept well, because it is quite important. A lot of times it comes around the idea of making, for example, jokes or comments that are inappropriate, right? And incivility doesn't always come from a malicious intent. I think it's important for us to discuss that. Bullying, there's a malicious intent, it's very clear most of the times, but incivility doesn't always come from a malicious intent. It could be unconscious bias, for example, right? Well, okay, some messages coming in. Let me just scroll back up. Not being informed of things that are important to the person. Yes, and this is also bordering downright sabotage, right? Purposefully not using preferred pronouns. That's it. Perfect. Not saying good morning and good night. Yep, that's it. Even rude tone of voice. Yep. Never saying thank you after doing a task. Yep. I've seen workplaces where a leader may say something that is disrespectful, and that same phrase then starting to crop up in other places. Yes. And this is spot on, right? Is one of the things that they've seen with incivility. They've actually, there's a study that shows that if someone is the recipient of uncivil behavior in the morning, they are much more likely to be uncivil towards someone in the latter part of the day, and to also have poor productivity. That's very interesting. And there's another one. Sorry, someone is not muted and I can hear my echo. There is this thing that you said here, the leader used the phrase and then the phrase gets repeated somewhere else. That's exactly how incivility works. It's part of that spiral, and also part of the fact that it's a work group phenomenon, right? It's not at an individual level. It happens in groups. Undermining staff in meetings. A senior leader has a number of his staff looking to work at a different physical office so they don't have to sit next to him. Sounds like he's afraid of his stuff. Having work ignored. Yes. Being talked about by others in the organization. Yes. So gossip, for example, that's actually, when you look at gossip, slander, incivility, bullying, these are all psychosocial hazards. So psychosocial hazards are aspects of work that are detrimental to employee mental health. And in fact, organizations in Australia and New Zealand have a legal obligation to monitor psychosocial hazards and eliminate or reduce them as is practicable. So keep that in mind, and I'll come back actually to this point when we go to the recommendations. The team will have to pull finger to get this done, i.e. they are not working hard now. Right, so that's something that someone says. Yeah. Not replying to messages or emails, especially if other people are getting replies. Yes, for sure. The silent treatment and public criticism. Yeah. Very instructing and transactional requests. Yeah. Being given menial tasks deliberately to undermine you and then micromanaging you. Oh, absolutely. And this is actually bordering bullying. This example is, I would say it qualifies as bullying. Ghosting, ignoring voices in meetings and not making eye contact, right? So you see here how in these examples, we've identified all of these instances are spot on. And we see how some of these behaviors are also linked to more potentially significant offenses, such as bullying. Now, let's move on to the next part, the second part, which is how to spot if your people are thinking about leaving. And I want to give you a checklist. So I'm just going to go through a series of questions. And if you have someone in mind, you can think about them, or if you have a team, if you're a leader of a team, you can think of your team. So number one, have they made formal complaints about uncivil behavior? So has this person that you have in mind, or has your team made formal complaints about uncivil behaviors, formal or informal for that matter? Have they made off-the-record remarks about uncivil behaviors in their team? Have they taken more sick days than usual? This is a sign, right? When you're trying to avoid the offender or distressing situations. Are they more negative than usual, expressing dissatisfaction with the organization or with their colleagues? This, by the way, can also be a symptom of burnout, right? So when someone is exhausted, when someone has symptoms of emotional exhaustion, if you remember, that's one of the dimensions of burnout, or cynicism, this type of behavior is also quite common. And so when you see this, it could also be a sign of burnout. Do they react more easily? Are they more edgy or irritable? This, again, can be a sign of burnout and a sign of mental distress. So usually when we are challenged, so different challenges come our way in life, and that's natural, and in fact is something that we want, right? Stress is actually something that we need in order to thrive and be happy. So that's not the problem. The problem is when there's so many challenges coming our way, or the intensity of a particular challenge is so high that we don't have enough ability to have resources or build resources to meet that challenge. So that means we become stretched, for lack of a better word. And when we are stretched, one of the first things that becomes apparent is that we are a bit more irritable. They're a bit angrier. And so therefore, number 4 and 5 are signs of mental distress and potential burnout. And as we've seen in the previous slides, you need to uncover what is causing that. And incivility and disrespect is one potential cause. But other potential causes can include other psychosocial hazards in the workplace, such as, for example, high workload and low resources, or high work pace. Number 6, have they been given more work to do than normal? Right? So perhaps your company has had many resignations, there aren't enough people to do the job. This means that the workload for your existing people is high. And we know that if someone is experiencing high workload, low resources for an extended period of time, they are likely to develop symptoms of burnout. And we also know from research, when your people are burnt out, they will be thinking about leaving your organization. Have they not received praise from their manager recently? This is very important. Recognition is a very important element, and it doesn't have to be necessarily financial recognition. Verbal recognition is very powerful. Recognition from the executive leadership is very powerful, right? And it's a protective factor against burnout, for example. Of course, to some extent, you can't expect people to engage in working long hours over an extended period of time, and you can't expect them to be okay just by you saying great job, right? So keeping this into consideration. But we know, for example, with number 7, that lack of recognition is correlated with an increased intention to leave the organization. Number 8, are they showing signs of burnout, such as exhaustion, inability to think clearly, tasks that usually felt easy now feel difficult, or that kind of brain fog? That might be a symptom of burnout. And again, as I mentioned before, burnout has been linked with employee attrition. There are several studies showing this. Do they have a negative opinion about your organization's response to COVID? Right, we've seen that actually employees from organizations who have had a good response to COVID are more likely to stay with the organization, and the opposite is also true. And number 10, are they distant with their colleagues? And what I am looking for in this question is, what you are actually identifying in this question is that dimension of depersonalization, that burnout dimension of depersonalization, which, as I mentioned before, has been linked with employee intention to leave the organization. And last but certainly not least, have they expressed disappointment at career development opportunities? We also know that lack of career development is, again, a factor that influences people's decision to leave an organization. Now, I just want to give you an organizational checklist. Just like thinking about your organization as a whole and what you've been doing the past 2 years since COVID. Have you measured organizational sentiment about your COVID response? I think it's important that you do that if you haven't already. Do you have a way for people to report incivility that is easy to use? So most organizations have systems for bullying, but they don't have systems for incivility. In fact, incivility in this respect are not really talked about in most organizations. And that is a problem, because if you spot incivility and you act on it, the soonest you spot it, the soonest you act on it, the better placed you are to create a workplace where your people will thrive and your business will flourish. Because there's an absolute link, right, between that. People thriving, they are more productive, they want to stay with the organization, and therefore the commercial outcomes reflect that. Does your executive leadership embody the company values? And this is a big one, right? We've seen examples where there's, for example, a mention, employee well-being somewhere in it could be in the company values, or it could be simply in memos sent, look after yourself. But actually the executive leadership does not embody those values. Their decisions are not congruent with those values, right? Do people in your organization share the same understanding of what is civil behavior and what is expected of them in the workplace? This is an important one, because as I mentioned before, incivility is not always caused by a malicious intent. There are instances when it is caused by unconscious bias. There's instances when it's caused by unawareness. And so, question number 4. Question number 5, do you provide specific training to your managers to deal with incivility in the workplace? And I think this is a crucial thing, absolutely crucial, because your manager is your front line when it comes to this, right? They have so much power in shaping the culture of the team, and then by extension, the culture of the organization. And I believe insufficient training is given to managers to address this topic, a topic that can be so important and have such significant repercussions for an organization. All right. Now, let's move on into the practical side. What can you do to retain employees? And I'm going to share with you a couple of ideas, and then we'll move to Q&A. So, first idea is to conduct an audit of your company culture. And so here, my recommendation is to do a psychosocial hazard audit. So what does that mean? It actually means to measure Psychosocial hazards. Again, I'm going to define them. Psychosocial hazards are aspects of work that can have a negative impact on your employee mental health. I'll give you examples of psychosocial hazards. Workload, work pace, shift work, poor relationship with supervisor, poor relationship with colleagues, lack of role clarity, lack of autonomy at work, incivility, bullying, harassment, cyberbullying. And these are just some examples, right? And so most organizations, they actually don't have a tool to conduct a psychosocial hazard audit. And that's what it is. Most organizations are used to using engagement surveys, right? But engagement surveys don't offer adequate data with regards to this psychosocial hazards audit. You can, if you just want to use as a culture audit for your company, you just want to do a culture audit, then you can use data from satisfaction surveys or pulse surveys. You can also review your EAP data and absences, and also review your complaints and HR cases. So basically, you need to look at your organization, see what your existing surveys are telling you, and consider adding on a psychosocial hazards tool. And if you want to talk more about that, you can let me know, and we can have a chat. I can talk more about what that is. Number 2, consider a civility workplace intervention. So if you have identified that there are issues of incivility in your workplace, consider acting, and acting now rather than later. And so prerequisites before you do that is leadership involvement. So the leadership needs to be involved and actually commit to making changes to the organization. And my recommendation is, oh, sorry, just someone is not muted. To work with a provider that ensures the intervention is co-designed with your people. So it's not just coming in with a one size fits all, here you go, there's your training, good luck, but rather co-design it, because every organization is different. And when you go through a process of co-design, there's much more buy-in from your people. And also work with providers that have an evidence-based approach. So what that means is that they actually show you, okay, well, we're not just imagining what could work from your organization. We actually have research data that backs up the strategies that we're going to implement with you. And be prepared to commit time, because cultural change doesn't happen overnight. The third thing is leader training. So I cannot stress how important it is to train your managers. And I would recommend deploying leader training alongside the cultural intervention, right? And again, co-design and evidence-based approaches. These are 2 key elements that you should always ask of your providers, right? Whenever you ensure, like if you want someone to conduct a psychosocial hazard audit for you, ask, where is the evidence? How is this going to fit our specific needs, right? The fourth recommendation is to hire for civility. And so this comes from the work of Porth and Pearson. As I mentioned to you, these are the key researchers in the area of incivility. And so what they recommend is using group interviews and involving your current employees in hiring decisions. And this can be very powerful. So basically, you want to spot potential problematic candidates before you hire them, before you bring them in. And these group interview kind of scenarios and tasks can be very useful. The 5th recommendation is lateral career development. And so this comes from the work of Stalin and Zweig. And what they talk about is, so one way of retaining your employees is to offer them lateral opportunities to develop in your organization. So not everyone, what we've seen in research is that not everyone necessarily wants to climb the career ladder, but people are interested in diversifying their experience, trying something new, right? So what I recommend is that you do what are called retention interviews. So what that means, sorry, maybe it's not retention interviews. How is that? Stay interview, I believe is the word. But what I mean is that you interview your people, the ones you already have, and you find out what they want and try to give it to them, right? So offering these lateral career development opportunities can be really, really powerful. And my last recommendation is thinking about work schedules. So for a lot of people, flexibility is important. So if you have the option in your organization to offer remote work, do it, because that is going to give you an advantage over other organizations who are more strict about their policies. Another thing and recommendation that comes from research, again, is to make your schedules more predictable for frontline employees. So there will be employees, you won't be able to offer them remote work, but for those employees in that position, frontline employees, shift work employees, making schedules predictable for them can be a really significant factor that can differentiate you from other providers and can make you an employer of choice compared to other providers. All right, that was intense. So I wanted to make sure we have time for Q&A. So I'm just going to open it to Q&A, and I noticed some messages in the chat.
Yeah. Georgie, I wonder if we want to have people put their hand up using the reactions at the top.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to do it any way you guys want to.
Or they can put it in the chat, either one.
Yeah. Yeah, Tony, my nursing daughter would love a predictable schedule. Yes. And nurses were one of the occupations that I had in mind. And an occupation where shift work, for example, has an incredible impact on mental health. Not always a good one. Let me see. Let me scroll back up. Praise is great, but sometimes feels hollow when the impact of your work is not visible. Yes. So I think that's spot on, Paul. It's got to be genuine. Otherwise, clearly, employees would lose trust in their managers and trust in the organization. Often there is a process for reporting in civility, yet the issue becomes lack of action following that report. Yes, and that's correct. In a lot of organizations, this is the case. And so the recommendation is to work with your HR to put those policies in place, right? What happens if it's incivility from a colleague? Then what's the next action? Then what happens if it's incivility from a manager? What's the next action, right? So you almost draw it as a diagram. If this, then that. Managers often let incivility go on and on. Yes, some do, and it's various reasons why. It could be that they don't know how to address it. They don't know what to say. And that's when training for managers in how to say this, how to have those uncomfortable conversations is very, very important. What's less? Lack of psychological safety prohibits any real action being taken further up the line. Yes. And so here, you see, I just wanted to clarify something. We have two concepts. We have the concept of psychological safety, and we have the concept of psychological health and safety. So psychological health and safety is a legal obligation that relates to those psychosocial hazards, those aspects of work that are detrimental to mental health. So employers, both in Australia and in New Zealand, have a legal obligation to monitor that and to eliminate or reduce as is practicable. We've seen our colleagues in Australia have become much stricter about this legislation, and WorkSafe Australia in several states are conducting audits, and they're currently hiring inspectors to conduct those audits even further. And psychological safety is a concept that actually was, it came about in the 1960s, and then it was kind of forgotten, and then it was made popular by the work of Amy Edmondson. And so it relates to the fact that someone feels safe in an organization to express their opinion, to own up to mistakes, to learn together, right? And so, of course, an environment that is healthy promotes that that psychological safety, right? In civility and the skills shortage, does this influence the tolerance of this behavior? Well, so far with the Great Resignation, what we've seen is that there's less tolerance of those behaviors. In other words, because of the market we are in, and because people feel they can find another job much more easily, they are less likely to tolerate uncivil behaviors or tolerate workplaces where the culture is not good for them, right? And so that has certainly been one of the drivers, right, behind the Great Resignation in the States, but also behind the resignation that we've seen here in New Zealand and Australia. What is the danger where anecdotally you think the results of the assessment are not going to turn out well? What do you have to do upfront? I would say upfront, there needs to be a commitment from leadership to act on the results, and also a commitment to share the results with the team. So when you survey your people, and you can use either an instrument that's specific for an issue like incivility or culture, or you can use your engagement surveys or whatever. Once you go through the assessment, it is important to share those results with your staff, and it's important for them to see an executive leader there and say, okay, this is a problem and we're going to work on it, and this is what we are going to do, right? This is the commitment to change. And it doesn't have to start with very big actions, but showing that there is a commitment to change, showing that we're not hiding from the problem is very powerful. But I would say up front, there needs to be commitment from executive leaders. Someone who hasn't performed well, who is now citing burnout and mental health issues. How do you distinguish between burnout and poor performance? That's a very good question. And what we need here is actually the manager of this person and the records that they have taken of conversations with this person. The other factor that plays into this conversation is, has this person had workload that was inappropriate? Did they have lack of resources? Right? Now, one of the things that is really important in an organization is to have data, and data that is reliable. So for example, if you as an organization have data on burnout levels, it's easier for you to put together a case and to say, for example, across the team, we've had this burnout score, for example, that shows that we are not at risk of burnout, for example, right? So it's important to have data so that you have these conversations and you can actually use it, right? But if it's anecdotal, if it's just what this person said and then what their manager said, well, it's a bit more difficult to say that, right? Because it's also, you need to take into account with mental health that it is about how the individual perceives the impact of whatever the event is. So let's take an example. Let's say event A. It doesn't matter what it is, but it's event A. And you have person 1 and person 2. They are working in the same organization, in the same team. They've experienced the same event. Person 1 is not really affected by it, right? It's like whatever, it was perhaps a difficult moment, but they forgot about it. They moved on. They are happy and functioning well. Person 2 was much more affected by that event. They are not able to forget about it. They ruminate. they have a series of symptoms of mental distress, right? So it's important to think that when we think about mental health, it is about how the individual perceives that and how it responds to that, right? And so no two people are alike. And therefore, in a situation like this, there's a variety of information that you need to gather, right? So with this employee, have they seen a doctor? Has there been any kind of diagnosis of their state of mental well-being? What are their manager notes? When did the performance issues start? What were the factors in the team? Do the team as a whole struggle with issues of workload, for example, or with issues of burnout, right? So you would have to look at all of these factors. Can you talk about when you have an uncivil, toxic person who is a star performer, but the leader doesn't address it because they see that person as valuable? This is so spot on. And this happens quite a lot. Just as an example, you have in sales, you have someone who is a really top performer in sales, but who's not a team player at all, who is quite competitive, puts his colleagues down, doesn't mentor young people well. So what do you do? Well, in this case, the manager of this person is responsible to give this top performer feedback. And the way you would frame this feedback is around the fact that is around career progression. So we know that if you want to progress in your career to a more senior leadership position, one of the crucial elements of that is supporting new talent, mentoring people, building a sense of a team. And these are areas where you lack. And then you go with examples. So for example, this and this and this, right? So you frame a performance development conversation around those factors, and you actually put them as key performance indicators so that whatever their area of work is, the area they excel at is not the only performance indicator. But of course, here you need the manager of this person to be on board, right? I am concerned about the emotional toll on managers. They have had to absorb a lot over this past period. How do we help them to look after themselves in order to help their team more? And you're spot on, Jenny. And actually, there's research that's come out. Professor Jared Har from AUT has conducted a study of burnout in New Zealand, and he found that managers are, and I'm trying to remember the number now to quote it correctly, I believe it was 141% more like it's 141 times more likely to experience burnout than staff. So you're spot on there, because managers have been kind of put in this position to, well, they had to deal with their team. They had to deal with their own high workload. They had to support their teams, right? If people were sick, they had to bring that on. So it's very spot on. So what do we do about it? Well, several things. Some things will have to be at an organizational level. So what I mean is looking at work design. So for example, you conduct that psychosocial hazard audit. You identify exactly what aspects of work are impacting which teams. Then you have to narrow it down based on data to put measures into place in those particular teams. So maybe it means that you need to hire one more person, or maybe it means that I don't know, there's different, it depends on what those factors are, but you need to know what specifically is the cause of this stress and then act specifically on that. And training on mental health can be very powerful, right? It's not a solution to the problems. You have to look at the work design. But on the other hand, giving individuals very simple tools to first and foremost find out how our brain tricks us into creating unnecessary stress. This is a reality. It's in our neurobiology. We create stress for ourselves unnecessarily. So you can give people some very practical techniques so they change their stress response. This is very helpful. But again, it has to be two approach, right? You need data, you need to look at the work design, make appropriate changes, and then this type of training is also useful. Thoughts on the relationship between perception of incivility and personalities more prone to emotional instability. There isn't conclusive research on that. So all I can say here is speculation. And my question would be, what are personalities more prone to emotional instability? I'm not sure that I could give a definitive answer of what that is. What I can say, however, is that we've all had different events in our earlier life, right? We've had exposure to different events. Now, if we've been exposed to certain traumatic events, it doesn't have to be a big deal. It can, it can be something relatively small, but that felt traumatic for us. We develop certain sensitivity, and perhaps sensitivity is not the right word here. The idea is that every single human being has what is called a cognitive distortion. So these are patterns of thinking that are not true. So I'll give you some examples. Yeah, I'll give you some examples from the work of Dr. David Burns. Dr. David B. Burns is a psychiatrist at the University of Stanford, and he's worked in the field of cognitive behavioral therapy, and he's primarily worked with people with anxiety and depression. And by the way, most of us humans have or will have anxiety or depression at one point in our lives. It's just the way it is. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's simply because of the way our brain is wired. And so in his work, he identified the 12 common cognitive distortions, so these unhelpful patterns of thought that affect people with anxiety and depression. So let me give you some examples. One is what is called mind reading. Mind reading is when you think that other people are thinking badly of you. So for example, you are, you're walking down the hallway and you notice two colleagues and they're talking. They have like a quiet conversation and you kind of notice them looking at you, and then they say something and you think, oh, they must be saying something about me. They must be saying something bad about me, right? I'll give you another example. Let's say you gave a presentation and your colleagues came up and say, oh, that was really good. But one of your colleagues came up and said, it didn't really have anything new. I kind of knew everything that you said. Now, a cognitive distortion called maximization means that you maximize the negative, and minimization means that you minimize the positive. So what happens in your mind is afterwards, you just think about it. And you just think about that one comment and just think about it. It's like, oh, and then you conclude, my presentation was not good. I'm a failure. I'm no good at presentations, right? So when you say something like this, I'm a failure, for example, that is, there's something that's called personalization. So you just take one thing and you make it into a quality of yours. So I've just given you some examples that I believe most of us have had going through their minds in our lives, right? So these cognitive distortions, they exist for every single human being. And we all have our triggers, right? Even the people with the happiest childhoods, they have had experiences that have made them form these negative patterns of thought and negative patterns of reaction. So in that sense, we are all prone to emotional instability depending on what the trigger is, right? And so it's important for us to learn that there are cognitive distortions, that no human being is free of them, and that there are ways for us to regulate our emotions and regulate our thoughts so that we are more effective. I'm aware of managing the psychological safety of my team. However, it gets tricky when our jobs intertwine with other organizations and different values and ways of working. Okay. I'm not sure what to say here. I think you can use that to your advantage, right? So if you interact with an organization and there's behaviors that you see that you disapprove of, you can use it to make you as a group, your people, stronger, right? So you create, what you can do in your team is you can create a space for your team to debrief on that, right? So maybe on your monthly meeting, you can do it on Fridays, and you just come together and you shared your highlights and your lowlights. And I'm using these words from a client. And so they used to do that, right? So you share your highlights, what went well, what with the clients, blah, blah, blah. The lowlights was, what was problematic. And so you as a team leader, you set the tone, look, I want us to talk about different aspects, and I want us to talk about our well-being, and I want us to talk if you notice these instances. So you can use that to make your team stronger.
Now, Georgie, I'm sorry, we're not going to have time to get through any more questions, unfortunately. It's been so wonderful, and we've had such great questions coming through. So I think in the last couple of minutes, maybe we can get you to what's your call out here? So do we have people connect with you on LinkedIn? How can people connect with you?
Yeah, absolutely. We can connect on LinkedIn. You can connect by email. What I'll do is I'll send the slides to Tanya, and I'll include there my contact details. And then if you want us to continue our chat, you can just get in touch by email or LinkedIn.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for your time, Georgie. It's been amazing. And for everybody here, thank you for joining us. Please join the Business Agility New Zealand group on LinkedIn if you're not already a member, so that you can keep track of what the Auckland and Wellington teams will be delivering next. And our next one for Auckland, we've got Dr. Zach Mercurio, author of The Invisible Leader, which is a fabulous book. And so he'll be the next one speaking for Auckland. More details will come on our LinkedIn group. So thank you, everyone. Thanks so much, Georgie.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have
Georgie.
a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Awesome presentation.
Thank you.
Great stuff.
Thank you.